Well, welcome everybody to the Kennedale Historical Society meeting for the month of March. We've got a very special guest with us tonight to talk about his books. But I want to plug our speaker next month. Next month in April, we always meet on the third Thursday of the month. And this is Thomas O. McDonald's book, Texas Rangers, Ranchers, and Realtors, the James Hughes Callahan and Dave family in the Guadalupe River Basin. That's our speaker next month. And then in May, we're going to have Wayne Winters and Myra Rickard talk about the Winters family and growing up in Kennedale. But tonight, our speaker is the author of Texas Ranger Captain William L. Wright. And so without further ado, I'll introduce Rick McCaslin. Thank you, Rick.
Thank you, sir. Y'all be sure to come back and hear Tom McDonald. I helped him on that book. He's also got another book coming out on May the 8th on the history of the Alcon labs, where he worked for many, many years as a chemist and researcher and all that. So be sure to ask him about that and bring him back. He's a good guy. Even if he is a scientist. We worked together on that book a lot. Before I get started tonight, I'm going to do my advertising part. This is the commercial part of my program. I used to teach at the University of North Texas, where I was a TSHA history professor, and that was for 19 years. And then I retired from there as of August 2023. I was retired all of about 24 hours when friends of mine called from the Texas State Historical Association. So I am now the Director of Publications, for short, the TSHA. We are the oldest continuously published academic journal in the country. Take that, Massachusetts and Connecticut, but also note continuously published is the key two words in that sentence. Yes, their journals are older than ours, but we've never missed an issue, and they have. Counts. We are the oldest academic press in the state of Texas. We have published over 230 books since 1918. We are the largest historical organization in the state of Texas. Our annual meeting this past month, just a few weeks ago, attracted over 500 people. There were over 30 sessions spread out over 3 days. Great show, great time. We had vendors, etc. And as I was saying earlier tonight to a couple of folks, we're going to have the annual meeting next year in Irving, so it's going to be right there in your backyard. We'd love to see you. Come by, check out the vendors, maybe go to some sessions, and enjoy yourselves. It's a history nerd's heaven. We try to make it welcoming and open to everyone. We're coming back stronger than ever. You may have read about us in Texas Monthly, Texas Observer, etc., etc. I have very strong opinions on the, I don't know, let's use a very direct and technical term, the crap they published. And the people who put it up in there, some of them probably ought to be sitting in jail right now for the money they stole, the programs, and the people they hurt, but that's not the way the world works, is it? So we're back. We're back stronger than ever. We're over 100 years old. We've been around since 1897, and we're doing just great. Education programs, publication programs. We published a Texas Almanac. We published a Handbook of Texas online. Surely some of you have run across that. We publish books. We have a journal for the high school students. We have a journal called Junior Historians, or Texas Historians now. We have a journal for the college students called Touchstone. But not a whole lot we don't do. So we've been around, we try to be very helpful, and we would enjoy your support. That's the end of my commercial. So, back to the regularly scheduled programming. This is William L. Wright. He is one of the most famous Rangers of the first part of the 20th century. He's one of the big four. Frank Hamer, Lone Wolf Gonzalez, William L. Wright, and of course Tom Hickman of North Texas. All of them famous in their own right, but you probably have never even heard of William L. Wright because he doesn't look the part, does he? He's about 5'8", 165 pounds, dripping wet, probably not there. He's probably not 165 there in his advanced age. He's nearsighted. Doesn't look like a tough guy, but we'll talk about some fights he was in and some of the things that made him El Capitan Diablo in the eyes of some people, especially down along the Mexican border. Why did I do the book? I'll tell you a better story in a minute, but the simple story is I've been getting a lot of the feedback you have about how evil the Rangers are. You know, they took down the Texas Ranger statue at Love Field because it made some people feel ooky. Actually, it made one Dallas City Council member feel ooky, so it was removed upon the order of one person because he was unhappy about what was going to come out in a book that hadn't yet come out by that time. If you ever thought your political leaders could be really silly, got news for you. So he removed it on his one order on the basis of what one book said that he hadn't even read yet, he just heard about it. That's the sort of place we're at now. I actually had all green lights to publish this book on William L. Wright. This is my second Texas Ranger book. The first one was on Rip Ford. You can have me back to talk about him sometime. Different Ranger, different era, different stories. The University of Oklahoma put together a new faculty committee of the usual suspects, the directors of various programs, none of which had anything to do with history or even reality. And they decided they don't publish books about, and this is a quote, Nazis and white supremacists anymore. So this book that was supposed to come out of Oklahoma came out of the University of North Texas Press. So as you can see, I'm kind of on a mission. Kind of tired of hearing that kind of crap. And there's that word again. This guy I thought was a perfect example of there have been many Rangers over the many different periods of Texas history, some of whom made mistakes. I'm not going to deny that. We can actually talk about that in the QA if you want. But this is a guy who worked hard, and his one motto is to be worth his paycheck. The reporter asked him one time, what drives you? What makes you tick? He said, I just want to be worth my paycheck. Good old country boy, right? He ends up being one of the first members of the Hall of Fame down at the Waco, Texas Ranger Museum. He ends up being one of the top 4 Ranger captains in the first half of the 20th century. And I would argue he was well worth his paycheck. So we're going to talk about him tonight. And I invite you, the book is still in print. Love to have you buy one. Christmas is coming. If you don't like it, you can give it to somebody else. Pass it on. The first question anybody asks me all the time, why did you write a book about William L. Wright? This is why. I was writing a book on Sutherland Springs. It's all about timing, guys. I bring out a book on the history of Sutherland Springs 5 months before that lunatic walked into the church and killed all these people. Talk about a sad day. But in the course of writing that book, there was this story about a local sheriff who was hanging a guy. The fellow that was being hanged was Raoul Jurek. He had raped and stabbed a 15-year-old Czech girl multiple times and left her for dead laying by the road. That girl stood up with his knife stuck in her chest, walked 2 miles to her house and told him, Raoul did this to me. So it's not like they didn't know, right? The sheriff showed up. His name was William L. Wright. He arrested Jurek, who was camped in the nearby woods, fought off a mob in a small town, Lavernia, who wanted to lynch Jurek on the spot. But Wright stood up in the back of the wagon with a Winchester and said, the first one who takes my prisoner dies. So he saved Jurek's life. Jurek had a normal trial, was convicted, and sentenced to hang. It's the only person William L. Wright ever hanged as sheriff. 15 years as sheriff, this is the one guy he's got to hang. He gets up there on the platform with several other sheriff friends around him. He agreed to let Jurek shake his brother's hand goodbye. The brother shakes his hand, leaves the platform. Wright starts to put the hood over his head, and Jurek stabs him right in the center of the chest with a sharpened spoon that his brother had slipped him.
Oh my gosh.
That doesn't happen too often, does it? This caught my attention. Now, Wright actually finished the hanging. He had to take a moment, compose himself. So with blood all over his shirt, he got back on the platform, and they finished hanging Jurek. Then Wright went to the hospital for 3 weeks. Thought, this man intrigues me. So I told a friend of mine, Jody Ginn, who runs part of the team that runs the museum down at Waco. I said, I'm interested in doing this book on a guy named William L. Wright. He said, come by my house. I was having breakfast with him in Austin. I live in Denton. Jody had been my doctoral student. He published a book under my supervision. He did really well. So I said, wait. He said, just come by. He handed me boxes of papers that were the papers of Wright's son, Dogie. This is Dogie, also a longtime ranger, customs agent, sheriff's deputy, and Jody said, somebody gave me these papers, and I'm not ever going to do anything with them, so here you go. So I tell people I got interested in Wright through the Sutherland book, and then my friend Jody, my former doctoral student, handed me a book in a box. All these papers, and said, well, I got to do something with them, right? So off to the races we go. Now, Wright is very typical in that he was a Texan, born and bred in the 19th century, working with the early Texas Rangers. Most of them that worked with the Texas Rangers by the late 19th century were being born and raised on farms in Texas. Wright was born outside of Bastrop, over near Lockhart, in his maternal granddaddy's house in 1868. He then settled with his family, his mom and dad, over near Cuero in DeWitt County, which is about 25 miles east-southeast of San Antonio. You can see it on this map here. This is San Antonio. If you go straight out where you see the little brown and go straight up north, that's DeWitt County. So, his daddy was not a ranger. His daddy came from Mississippi, settled in the DeWitt County area before the Civil War, became a merchant, later a justice of the peace. He was worked in the militia during the Civil War because he had a family to take care of. Mostly he ran livestock and was in the Home Guards. This is his mama, Anne Elizabeth Tumlinson Wright, and that ties into a very famous ranger family. William L. Wright, from my count, has at least 37 relatives who served as Texas Rangers. Yeah. Going all the way back to some of the very first. Tumlinson, her grandfather, was the guy who established the Texas Rangers in 1823. Now you're going to say, no, Stephen F. Austin did. Wrong. This is one of these debates that goes back and forth. Austin will inherit the two companies that John Tumlinson founded in the early summer of 1823. Now, John Tumlinson was never a ranger. He was the local alcalde for the district. But he had problems with Karankawas, problems with Spanish deserters who had basically decided to make a living in the area by preying off local settlers. So he asked the governor if he could form a company of rangers. The governor gave him permission. Tumlinson organized the company, turned it over to a guy named Robert Kirkendall to command. And then ironically, Tumlinson was killed by Indians while he was traveling to San Antonio to pick up money and supplies for the ranger company he'd helped organize. But his sons go on to be famous rangers, 4 or 5 of them, and one of them, James Tumlinson, was Anne Elizabeth Tumlinson Wright's dad. Excuse me, Joseph Tumlinson. We have a picture of him as well. There's Joseph L. Tumlinson. Now, he's not nearly as famous as a couple of his brothers Because Joseph was never, while he's the son of the man who founded the Rangers, he never commanded a company himself. He always seemed to be working with his brother John Tomlinson Jr., or his other brother Peter Tomlinson, or his other brother Andrew Tomlinson, all these Tomlinsons. Now you begin to figure out how come there's so many relatives of Wright in the Rangers. He goes back to the very first years, and they breed like rabbits. There's a lot of them that become Rangers. I always like putting Rebecca's picture in there because Wright remembered when he was a little kid, Rebecca used to scare the crap out of him by telling him that she could speak Kiowa. And she would act like an Indian and scare the mess out of him. She also apparently smoked a corncob pipe. This is all very fascinating when you're 6 or 7 years old, right? And Wright, as he was growing up, got to meet other famous Rangers, like Leander McNally's crew came to town twice when he was a young man. Unfortunately, they came to town hunting Joseph Tomlinson because by that time he had gotten on the wrong side of a feud, but that's another story, right? So Wright grows up, and I love this picture. I think he went to San Antonio, put on his best suit, and got his picture taken on his 21st birthday. By the time he's a teenager, about 14, 15 years old, Daddy passes away. So he's the oldest son. He's got to do something to support the family. So he did ranch and raise cattle. He went on cattle drives as far away as Wyoming. Didn't like it, he said. Too dang cold. So he came back, promised his mother he'd try better. About this time, he's moving into the Sutherland Springs, Wilson County area, which is where one of his sisters had married the local postmaster. He tried farming. What he would laughingly tell the reporters is it didn't rain enough. Other people remember that he and his new brother-in-law, Gratz Brown, seemed to like to go hunting a lot more than they liked to go plowing or hauling stuff or working too hard. This is the only picture I have of his wife. He married her in 1890. Do the math, that makes him about 24 years old. He's tried cattle ranching, he's tried driving cattle up the long trails, he's tried farming, doesn't like it much, and now he's married. By the way, her daddy was a ranger, 2 of her brothers were rangers, and 3 of the sons she will have with William L. Wright will become Texas Rangers. It's a family industry, isn't it? But this is Molly, and I'm sure she began to tell her husband, you know, you're having fun, but let's get some sort of a job here. So what does he have in his blood? It ain't gonna be cattle, it ain't gonna be farming. Sitting in a store is not his deal. He tried to work for his brother-in-law, that was boring. What's the one thing he's probably pretty good at? Being a lawman. So this is his first lawman job about the mid-1890s. This is Deputy William L. Wright on the left. And notice he's already growing that mustache. By the time he retires for the last time in 1939, he will be the only Texas Ranger in service allowed to have a mustache. But since he'd had one for about 50 years by that time, I guess they were scared to tell him to cut it off. Like he would have even listened to him anyway. This is William L. Wright in about 1895-96 as a deputy sheriff in Wilson County. Now, you'd think being a sheriff in a small county like Wilson would be pretty mundane, but he had some pretty quick, hard lessons on what it was going to be like to be a sheriff if he pursued that someday. Specifically, the Maximo Martinez case. Maximo Martinez was in his late 30s, had a wife and a couple of kids, but he decided he really liked this 18-year-old girl, Mexican girl, who lived with her grandparents. When she spurned him, he broke into their house one night, beat Grandpa and Grandma to death with an axe, then killed her and had sex with her. We are not sure of which order those acts happened. I know, gross, isn't it? Pretty grotesque case. So, Deputy Wright, a couple of members of the Tom family I was just talking to somebody about, tracked Maximo Martinez all the way down the Mexican border, brought him back. Tremendous circus of a case. This would be the other hanging that Wright was involved in, but it's not his hanging, it's the sheriff's job, right? But he's the deputy. Martinez decided he didn't want to go out quietly. they do all this polite, well, what would you like to have for your last meal? He decided he wanted a brass band. He wrote a song about himself that was to be performed. It's called a corrido. It's a traditional Mexican folk song. He wanted a large crowd, and it turned into quite a circus. There was a guy there selling fire extinguishers. He set a small house on fire and showed you how well that worked. The band was supposed to play this song. Martinez had prepared about a 2-hour speech. It was going to be quite the show. The sheriff put the kibosh on most of that. And I guess Wright is watching all this, because at one time he had to hang somebody. There was no brass band. There were no songs being sung. There were no speeches made. There was no big circus. No vendors, none of that. So Wright is watching all of this. Didn't dissuade him, though. What got him out of his job was politics. When the new sheriff gets elected, he gets to pick his new deputies, doesn't he? He didn't pick Wright. So Wright goes from being a deputy to applying to the state to be a special ranger. Now, this was important back then, and all the way up to very recently, because in an 1871 law, despite what you've seen in probably every Western and every Marty Robbins song you've ever heard, you could not walk around with a big iron on your head. That was against the law. In 1871 in Texas. If you saw somebody walking around with a big iron on his hip, he was either a very bad person or he had a lawman commission. And that's why when Wright applies to be a local security guy at another cattle ranch, he applies to the state for a special ranger permit, which will allow him to wear a pistol while he's out guarding the cattle and making sure bad people don't do bad things. Well, somebody saw that application and talked to the local sheriff, whose name, not Sutherland, it's his son-in-law. It'll come to me probably 10 minutes after. Craighead, thank you, John Craighead. Craighead told the people in Texas at the Ranger headquarters, the Frontier Battalion as it was called then, this is a special guy. You might want to give him something more than a special ranger commission. And so Wright will suddenly find himself a member of Company E, later Company C, commanded by John H. Rogers, one of the great captains of the late 19th century. There are 4 great captains. John Rogers is, to me, one of the more unique ones, because he emphasized 2 things to his rangers. Ethics, you had to go to church on Sunday, no drinking and no card playing, and quickness and accuracy with a gun. So while you took your lessons from your Bible on Wednesdays and Sundays, other days you were practicing your quick draw and whether you could hit what you aimed at. John H. Rogers, as I said, is going to be one of the more famous rangers of the late 19th century. He's one of the 4 great captains of that era, which of course then will give way to the 4 great captains, including William L. Wright. So Wright joins Company E. It'll later be redesignated Company C shortly before it becomes not the Frontier Battalion, but the Ranger Force. And he gets a 4-year tutelage very quickly, between 1898 and about 1902, on what it takes to be a ranger. Within 1 month, they are down in Laredo, where they're having a total nightmare over quarantines for smallpox. The local Mexican population doesn't understand this, and when Rogers and several of his rangers, and by the way, our intrepid, let's see if we can. If you look, this is Rogers down front doing this. Up over his right shoulder, second up, you can see Wright's very distinct mustache, and of course the glasses, because he's blind as a bat, just like me. That's William L. Notice he's wearing a coat and tie. He doesn't look like a lot of the Western movies. Rogers insisted that they look presentable. They go to Laredo, and sure enough, they get in a shooting match. They were sent down to round up some folks and bring them to the quarantine tents. Shooting broke out. Rogers, by the way, gets a good chunk of his humerus shot out from his right arm. They'll have to put his arm back together for him, and he'll end up for the rest of his life using a specially designed 25 caliber rifle, because you can't get a regular rifle up there. Wright distinguished himself fairly well, and he knows he can't really shoot all that well, so I love that he went into the fight wearing his 4-inch Ranger belt and twin pistols, but he was carrying a 12-gauge shotgun. You don't actually have to aim all that well, do you? Just get kind of close to him and pull the trigger, and something's going to happen. So the Laredo riot, as they call it, in 1899, 1899 was the baptism of fire for Wright. This is Company E just a few years later. Here's our guy over here, 1, 2, 3 from the right. The glasses and the mustache will always make you go right to him. Not a very big fellow. This is at Cotulla, Texas. Now, Wright by this time has endured labor riots and assassination attempts in Orange, where white workers were trying to throw black workers out of lumber mill jobs. He's been in the middle of the Townsend feud over at Columbus, Texas, which went on for years, survived that. In Cotulla, which is in Live Oak County, Wright won his reputation as a gunman. He was dealing with a fellow named James Day. Now, Day already had a reputation. He had killed a couple of guys and attacked a couple of Rangers, and he'd gone to jail for it for 5 years. He got out. He came, not David Davenport, came back to Cotulla, settled down, worked for a ranch there, but he really thought of himself as a real tough guy. And he didn't like the Rangers that were camped at Cotulla because they made him follow rules like no wearing a gun on your hip. They arrested him I found the records, they arrested him several times for sashaying into town with a gun on his hip, which is against the law. They put him in jail for a day or two and then released him, fined him $10. He didn't care for this. And he specifically didn't like that little blind as a bat mustached guy, because he seemed to be the one that was bugging him the most. So one day when Rogers was out of town, he was actually off testifying in court, Davenport decided this is the day I take out Lieutenant Wright. By this time, Wright was a lieutenant. And so he comes into town with his friend named Guy Smith, who was a newspaper man. Wright knew they were coming, so he rounded up the local constable, so you'd have an eyewitness. Put a rifle inside the front door of the saloon, Main Street, set a chair outside, and he and the constable sat and waited. And sure enough, here came Davenport, mouthing off. And Wright said, "Do you have a gun?" And he said, "Yeah, I got a gun. What do you want to do about it?" Well, Smith, thinking quickly, hustles Davenport, his buddy, off to the newspaper office. This would be about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. About 5 o'clock, Wright's just sitting there in front of the saloon, waiting to see what's going to happen. Here comes Davenport back, and obviously he spent the last 2 hours drinking. He's all fired up. Guy Smith is with him. Now, this time he can't stop him, so Guy Smith goes straight into the bar, not looking either direction, gets to the bar and orders something to drink, while his friend stays outside and picks a fight with Wright. Wright said, "Do you have a weapon?" Davenport said yes. This is all came up in the coroner's report, the coroner's jury met, these are all the testimonies. Wright said, "You have to give that over. I'm going to place you under arrest." Davenport said, "Try and take it." So Wright comes off the porch, the rifle is inside, remember, he's got his pistol, got a single revolver this time, and as he reaches for the pistol that Davenport's doing like this to show him he's got, Davenport pulls it and fires. Bullet goes through Wright's jacket. Wright then puts 5 slugs into Davenport. Remember what he's been training under Rogers' tutelage, right? Draw fast and hit what you're aiming at. 5 shots. Anybody know why only 5 out of a 6-shot revolver? That's your safety. You leave it on an empty chamber, right? So basically he emptied that pistol into Davenport, who of course died on the spot. .45 caliber slugs at close range has that effect on a man, right? Of course, Guy Smith is still there in the bar. Wright, I love this story. Walks in and says, "Are you carrying any weapons?" Guy Smith says no. Wright pulls a pistol out of his left pocket. "You got anything else?" Guy Smith said no. The bartender pulled a pistol out of his right pocket. So now we got 2 pistols. They eventually took brass knuckles, 3 knives, and 4 pistols off Guy Smith. Apparently he was looking to defend himself if something bad went down. Maybe he was more sober than Davenport. This makes Wright's reputation go, right? This is a legitimate, real-life gunfighter. Oh, he's a gunfighter now. Well, he's not real happy being a ranger. The pay is low. His family is growing. By this time, he has about 5 kids. And I'm sure Molly is telling him, "Hey, look, $50 a month as a ranger private ain't making it." Why ranger? Because most of these appointments to lieutenant were a temporary thing to get past judges trying to shut down the Frontier Battalion Rangers by saying they didn't have the legitimate authority to arrest anyone. Only an officer could. So what's the way to fix that? Declare everybody in your company is now a lieutenant. Congratulations. So if you're looking at your relatives and you say, "Wow, they became a lieutenant in the Rangers around 1901 or 02, I just told you why. And why suddenly they became a private again around 1903 when they changed the laws, organized the Ranger Force. So he's not making much money. He's not getting any shot or chance at being a captain himself because there's just so few of them. So sheriffs can make a lot of money. Why? Because they have a decent pay, but they also get to keep all the fees and penalties and fines they collect. You can make a good chunk of money as a sheriff in Texas. And so Wright resigns as a ranger, campaigns to be sheriff of Wilson County, and wins the election. Well, this is him with his brother Milam, and a cousin named Levi Old in Orange, Texas. This is Sheriff Wright. Notice he's still wearing his ranger belt. Wins the election. He'll be sheriff of Wilson County for 15 years. By the way, this is Luke. This is his deputy and chief jailer. If you ever want to see an interesting structure, go over to Floresville sometime when you're down in that area. The jail that Wright lived in with his family is still there. That's the way they built them. They saved money by, the family lived in the same building where the jail was. There's some great stories about escapes because the jailer, Molly, was cooking in the kitchen. Luke was out somewhere else, and so some prisoner just slipped down through the front hall and right out the front door. That happened. They're refurbishing it. It's going to be a museum. It should be an interesting place. So this is Sheriff Wright, 15 years. Growing family, he'll support them very well, and he'll do very well as sheriff. And again, you might think it's a quiet job to be a sheriff. He will send 53 people to the Huntsville prison in 15 years. Do the math. That's over 3, almost 4 per year. Most of those on capital offenses. Murder, rape, attempted murder, assault. People aren't any nicer then than they are now. And the problem back then is, if you look at it, and some of us like to hear these stats, the average number of years you spent in jail, even for murder, was less than 5. Governors are very free with pardons. Frustrating to be a lawman. So Wright will deal with all kinds of horrible, hard cases. Some of them more gruesome than others. I'll tell you a lot of detail. I will tell you that he does well enough that in 1915, after 13 years, he's elected president of the Texas Sheriff's Association. He gets the local Baptist minister to give his acceptance speech for him because he didn't want to give talk. He doesn't like it. Notice that mustache has got a little longer. They made him take his glasses off for these pictures. You can tell he's kind of squishy. Where you want me to look? But Wright is really gaining a reputation. He is now the top sheriff in the state of Texas. He's a veteran ranger who went through the Laredo riots, the Orange riots. He helped chase down Gregorio Cortez with his pistol in his hand, the Americo Paredes book. He has dealt with murders and suicides and all kinds of horrible cases. He's even had to hang a man. So, when in 1917 they decide to reorganize the Texas Rangers, some pretty ugly stuff had come out during the Texas border troubles. And so Governor Hobby, U.P. Hobby, has decided to reorganize the Rangers and bring in some top men to be his captains. And he calls up William L. Wright. And William L. Wright then will leave Wilson County after 15 years as sheriff, one of the longest ever, and return to being a ranger in 1918 officially, January 1. This was his command. This is their chuck wagon, driven by his cousin, Wright C. Wells, along with Thomas Connolly. This is Company K at Laredo. Wright is on the far right end, all the way down there. And, because I love this picture so much, this picture was taken about that time. Here's our intrepid Texas. Now he looks like a ranger, doesn't he? How many horse people in here? That's Jack. Jack's great-granddaddy was Steel Dust, the first ever quarter horse in Texas. That is a genuine steel duster, or what they will start talking about in 1941, they'll call them quarter horses now. But he's a descendant of Steel Dust. That was a gift from a grateful rancher in Wilson County who Wright recovered a lot of his stock from a thief. Wright has got that 245 caliber Colt single actions with pearl grips, with eagles carved on the handles, given to him by the people of Wilson County. I've always thought maybe they were trying to bribe him to stay. We have those pistols, by the way. That one of those pistols is still in the museum. He's wearing Mexican coin rowel spurs. He's wearing heavy chaps. And that carbine under his leg, that's a Tomlinson carbine. What does that mean? The Tomlinson had discovered that one of the most effective weapons in brush, thick brush, the chaparral of South Texas, where they operated a lot, was a sawed-off 30 caliber carbine. The local vendor in Austin called it the Tomlinson carbine, and it had become very popular. In fact, when Wright's company was offered 2 Thompson submachine guns to operate down the brush, he said, we don't need them. These are much more effective than any submachine gun. Now, later one of his rangers managed to talk him into letting him have one and sprayed half the county with one of a couple of times. The only limit on a Thompson is how long you can hang on to it, right? You know, fire. So Wright rides off to the border. That's where he's going to be posted. It's interesting. He will command 40 different rangers in the next roughly 6 years. He will never lose a man in service. He will never have an official complaint filed that proves to be legit. There was one complaint about one guy and it wasn't legit. He has an interesting mix of rangers. It's something I want to pause and always point out here. You know, we talk about the Rangers didn't have any Tejanos until the 1970s. Ranger Ray Martinez is a friend of mine. I respect him very much. But here's Wright's Company D in 1920, and here's 7 Tejanos out of 13 guys serving at Brownsville. Think about it. If you were an Anglo captain in Brownsville on the border, wouldn't you need a few guys who knows who's who, the language, the culture, the trails? Of course you do. There were Tejano Rangers all along, and here's 7 of them with Wright in 1920. Brownsville is also where Wright will find himself being called into the 1919 investigation of the Texas Rangers, and there were only 3 Texas Ranger captains considered to have come through that investigation with shining colors and were actually praised by the same committee that called for the resignation or removal of many other Rangers. That was Wright, John Hughes, his former captain, John Rogers, his former captain, and John Hughes, who was another one of the 4 great captains of the last part of the 19th century. So Wright comes out of that smelling like a rose, clean as a whistle. He's got his company together, and he almost dies on the streets in Brownsville. Walked out of the post office one day. Two soldiers walked up and said, "Hey, there's a drunk guy over there on the corner throwing liquor bottles at cars." Well, Wright's dressed just like you see him there. You don't see a badge. He didn't want to be confrontational. He wants his guys to look good but not pick a fight. Walks over to this Mexican guy who's drunk as a skunk and says, "Hey, quit throwing bottles at cars." The guy pulls a knife and whirls and stabs Wright right in the chest. There's a recurring motif here. That particular day, Wright had run out of his favorite cigarettes. Yes, he smoked. And had borrowed a tin of tobacco from one of his rangers. It was right here in his pocket. And so the Mexican just stabbed a metal tobacco box, which saved Wright's life. So Wright steps back, and when the guy comes at him again, Wright shoots him in the leg. Just like the movies say you're supposed to, right? The guy went down on the sidewalk, comes back up the third time, knife still in his hand, and Wright shot him in the face. And, you gave him. Again, an investigation considered to be a good shoot. Bad things happen. Maybe he shouldn't have been throwing bottles at cars. He apparently particularly didn't like cars with soldiers in them. Doesn't matter now. By the way, go and find a grave, you'll find this guy buried in Brownsville, the whole story about how he ended up buried in Brownsville. So Wright's got an interesting reputation. What's his job down there? Well, what did we do around 1920? Prohibition. So Wright's company is pretty much on the front lines of Prohibition. First year operating, 1921, they intercepted, confiscated, and destroyed, please don't cry, over 10,000 bottles of tequila. This, by the way, is when tequila becomes very popular in the U.S. because with all the bans on alcohol being made here and the difficulty of bringing in alcohol, say, through New York or Chicago, tequila was cheap and it was easy to get across the border, and we suddenly decided we liked that stuff. 10,000 bottles. It's funny, you can look at the inventories and there'll be like 1,000 bottles of tequila and 5 of mezcal. Now, that's obviously a very niche market, in case any of y'all ever tried that stuff. This particular haul right here, that is 3,000 bottles of tequila that they caught in 1 month down in November 1921. His company becomes #1 in tequila intercepted, but think about where they're operating. Brownsville to Laredo, they're on the front lines. He becomes #1 in number of people arrested, confiscation of horses, blah, blah, blah. He's in the right place at the right time doing his job. By the way, he never really seems to have thought that this was a good thing to be doing. A reporter later asked him, "What do you think about it?" He said, "It's my job. I swore to do my job, so that's what I did." He wouldn't go any further than that. So, Prohibition, that's their #1 job in the early 20s. It's not their only job, though. Railroad strike, 1922 at Denison, went all the way through the state and in fact was pretty much a problem in other states as well. They called every Texas Ranger but a handful into Denison to police the shops and try to keep shop workers and railroad workers from killing each other. And Wright's right here in the middle of it. If you look at the cupola right there, it comes straight down. You'll see those glasses and that mustache. He's right in the middle, Captain Wright. Now, once that peacefully is settled, Wright, and you can really see it in this picture, goes back to South Texas, back to chasing tequileros, tequila smugglers. But he's also called in when suddenly in Corpus Christi, Texas in 1923, the local sheriff decided he didn't much care for the guy running the opposition party, who happened to be a Ku Klux Klan guy. So he walks up to him on the open street in broad daylight, puts his gun up against his head and shoots him 3 times, killing him. The guy's name was Fred Roberts, the fellow he just shot. And you've ever been to Corpus Christi? The Fred Roberts Hospital down there, isn't there? Uh-huh. They don't even know, do they? Ku Klux Klan leader murdered in his car in broad daylight by the sheriff. Oh, and the deputy put another shot in Fred from the other side of the car. Now, Fred didn't have a gun, but local coroner quickly ruled it was self-defense. So they bring in, you ever heard of a guy named Frank Hamer?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yeah.
Guy who ran down by Glass? He was brought into town and he brought one guy with him, William L. Wright. They investigated, they got arrested the sheriff, 2 of his deputies for the killing. And this is such a perfect example. This is a broad daylight, multi-witness killing, and all 3 of them walked. That's what's frustrating about being a Texas Ranger. I would say more so in the past, but not always in the present. You do your job. You do your investigation. You have all the evidence. Everything is all set, and you walk while the guy you arrested does no time or very little. And so Wright will be involved with Frank Hamer for a while. He'll work with him again on the bank robber. Sometimes we don't show a lot of sense. They decided a good idea in Texas was to offer $5,000 bounties to anyone who killed a bank robber. You think there were some bad cases on that? You know, take your local, not too bright kid who hangs around the street corner and say, hey, here's a cat pistol, walk in the bank. I mean, literally, that was like that. And Frank Hamer investigated that too, along with Wright. Wright's career as a ranger suddenly came to a screeching halt when Ma Ferguson is elected. Ma and her husband Pa, remember Pa Ferguson, colorful governor, only one we've ever impeached and removed from office. And so he can never be governor again, so he ran his wife in 1924 on the slogan, and I'm not kidding, 2 governors for the price of 1. And we voted for him. Now, one of the problems with Pa is he would sell pardons by the handful. Ma was no better. If you took all the governors between 1900 and 1924 when she took office, except for Pa, piled them all their pardons up. She gave up more pardons in her first 6 months than all of them combined. Now, who might protest that? The Rangers. So who's going to get fired? All but 1 or 2. The Rangers. So she fires William L. Wright and most of his people. Yes, I know. Politics, thank God it's changed now. Moving right along. So, out goes William L. Wright. What can he do for a living? He's a lawman, so he gets a job as a police officer in Robstown. Why? Because that's where his daughter lives. One of his daughters has gotten married. She has kids there. So he's a police officer in Robstown for a couple of years. Then we get Jimmy All. Yeah, doesn't sound right. It's not Jimmy Allred. Dan Moody, excuse me. Dan Moody is elected governor. He wants to clean up the law, clean up the system. So he brings back a lot of the old captains, brings back a lot of the old Rangers, gets rid of the Ferguson Rangers. That's when Wright comes back in. This is him at the age of 59, 1927, on the far left end here. Now, somebody had asked, so how healthy can a 59-year-old Ranger be? The local newspaper interviewed him and declared that he was, quote, looking fit as a fiddle and stepping about according to his old form. Now, by this time, his old form was he was considered El Capitan Diablo for the work on the border. You know, they didn't want to deal with him because he would get you arrested. They also thought of him as the dean of the Texas Rangers. These are the kind of articles that had come out when Ferguson had fired him. Oh my God, they fired the dean of the Texas Rangers. But he went quietly. Now he's back quietly. And the job changes. Prohibition's fading out. Cattle rustling is kind of a thing of the past. what is going on. Oil boom towns. You have towns that go from being 50 people to 5,000 in about 6 months. Lots of money, lots of young guys with spare time on their hands and money in their pockets, and that's going to attract organized crime, isn't it? So oil boom towns become Wright's new business, along with people like Frank Hamer, etc. The most notorious is Wink, Texas. This is a picture of Wink, Texas around 1931. Wink is, excuse me, where you see Winkler County sticking up, the name Winkler in New Mexico, that's Winkler County, and Wink is the county seat. Anybody else know somebody famous who came from Wink? Somebody knows. Surely you do. This is Roy Orbison's hometown. Oh. Blue Bayou, man. Pretty woman. Back then, I'm not sure Roy would have ever gotten a shot at being a musician. Wink was a rough town. A federal judge tried to shut it down by revoking its charter. The mayor just kept right on going because he was hooked into both the drug and the alcohol ring there. Yeah. When the police chief got a little boisterous and decided to try and shut down the bad guys, he was shot to death in his own jail. So a new chief was brought in, which Wright kind of liked the new guy, until he found out he was actually an escapee from the Oklahoma State Penitentiary who had been serving 7 years on a manslaughter charge. So he arrested him. Wright will arrest hundreds of people in Wink, do his best to create murders, all kinds of stuff. What had happened here is there was a famous place called Borger up in the North Texas oil fields, and they had shut down organized crime there, so they all just moved to Wink. And I'm sure Wright was just so thrilled to see them showing up. There were times he had to go across the border, because right across in Jaw, there was a guy calling himself Two-Gun Dick Herwig. He'll go on to be a folk hero in Oklahoma, but Wright will pretty much put him in his place and shut down his operations. How does a Texas Ranger do that in New Mexico? Because he went over to Pecos and got the federal judge there to deputize them as federal agents for 48 hours. Went over, made his raid, came back, went back to work. Clever little booger, isn't he? He's tracking people as far away as Washington State, New York City, arresting them, usually for murder. That's what it would take you that far afield. Doing pretty well with his new batch of Texas Rangers. Again, no scandals, nobody lost in service. And then Ma gets reelected. So guess who loses his job again? This time she fired every one of them but one. She's pissed. In support of the last time. So Wright goes where? Back to Robstown to be a police officer. But he's not done yet. When Ma leaves office and Jimmy Allred takes over, Jimmy Allred brings Wright back in, but this time, Wright by this time, this is 1934-35. Wright is 66 years old, almost 67. He looks alive, much more. He has gone to the hospital for a couple of times for some procedures that I do not know the nature of, but they kept him in the hospital for a couple of weeks at a time. But this is his job. This is what he does. So they bring him back in as a Ranger Private, though everybody calls him Captain. And then when they flip over and become part of the DPS in 35, which is one of Allred's big reform movements, he's one of the few people who moves over to the DPS. So Wright is the only guy who ever served in the Frontier Battalion and the Ranger Force and the Texas Rangers as a division of the Department of Public Safety. He's the only guy who ever served as a Ranger under 7 different governors. He's also the only guy that they'll let keep a mustache. Would you tell him he's got to cut it off? Why bother? What's he doing for the last few years of his service? Because he'll stay in from 34 to 39. Chasing gamblers, pinball machine guys, dealing with labor outbreaks on the with the longshoremen along the Corpus Christi and Galveston waterfronts. He's apparently a good talker. He's a guy that can keep things from exploding too much. Or if things have already gone sour, somebody's gotten beaten to death by the longshoremen, he's the guy that comes in and establishes peace. Usually in a peaceful manner. So there's some interesting stories of longshoremen who got out of line and, right, they were walking to breakfast one morning, and a bunch of longshoremen charged him and 5 or 6 rangers, and his second in command, the sergeant, stepped in, grabbed a longshoreman, punched him one time, knocking him out cold, leaving him on the walk, and then they just walked on to breakfast, and Wright never even broached eye. Didn't see a thing. But they didn't get intercepted going to breakfast again. I know, times change. You gotta respect that. You know, he knows what has to be done sometimes. So Wright will slide into the quiet years of his career. He does get occasionally some very interesting assignments. 1936, this guy named Walter Prescott Webb has brought out a book on the Texas Rangers, and Hollywood has made a movie out of it. They're going to release the movie at the Centennial Celebration. So we need some old Rangers to sit around and look colorful, right? This is Wright, the small Stetson, looking kind of just beginning to shrink, isn't he? And that's John Hughes, another old Ranger. He's one of the great captains of the late 19th century, sitting there with one of the great captains of the early 20th century. Wright had a great time. He talked about staying at the Baker Hotel, all the pretty ladies. They gave him the key to the city, but he got kind of pissed off because the cheap boogers took him back after the ceremony was over. So you could have let me keep the key, for God's sake. And he also had, they wanted him to wear a big hat and giant boots, and he said, no, that's just soup and nuts stuff. I don't know exactly what that expression means, but he had a bunch of them. So, he likes the attention, He got to meet some guy named Roy Rogers. He got to meet Gene Autry. He got to hang out with stars. I think he liked it. But suddenly, in 1939, we get a new governor. Pass the Biscuits Pappy, who was absolutely determined to reduce the government of Texas, save money. And one of the things he cut was the DPS. And so one of the first layoffs was this much older ranger named William L. Wright. So finally in 1939, he's part of a RIF, a reduction in force. And this is him at home at his little place in Corpus Christi. Remember, the relatives and the daughter and some of her children had settled down there. And he will live there until his death in 1942. Very quietly, some people will still come and ask him, why didn't you fight? Why didn't you resist? Why didn't you just stay a ranger? And he said, look, I did my job. I followed orders like I was supposed to, and it's going to be okay. There's a wonderful picture I have, I don't think I have it in here, of him meeting LBJ, which is, no, I don't have it. It's funny because right by that time it shrunk to about this big, and of course LBJ is about this big. Wright's bending back looking at him. He passed away in early 1942, heart disease. Of course, the doctor noted on that perhaps he died of a broken heart because his son, his youngest son, was one of the lost battalion that was taken prisoner by the Japanese on Bataan and taken on the death march into Burma and was put to work on the Burma Road. By the way, he'll survive. He'll only weigh 116 pounds when he comes home, but he will survive and come home. He's as tough as his daddy, right? These are some things that I put up there to show the monuments to him. This is his granddaughter, laying a wreath when they put a monument up to him in 1967, 25 years later. There's a THC marker for him. Of course, this is at his grave in Floresville, Texas, because that's where he was buried, where he had served so long and so many of his relatives were interred. He will go on, as I said, to become known as one of the great captains of the 20th century. If you look in the Handbook of Texas Online, it'll give him that title. The Texas State Library and Archives has a website on the Rangers. They will give him that title. He will be one of the first 20 men inaugurated or inducted into the Ranger Hall of Fame in Waco when they opened in the late 60s. And now, thanks to me, he's one of the 3 great captains. There's still one that doesn't have his own book, and that's Hickman. But at least Wright has his own book now. All the 4 great captains of the 19th century have their own books. And now Wright's one of the 3 out of the 4 that has his book as well. Maybe one of you will write the Hickman book.
Does Peoples have a book?
Clint Peoples has a book, because I have a copy of it. However, I think it's an autobiography. I think he wrote a book on himself,
Oh,
which, knowing Clint Peoples, that's,
I didn't know him,
That's
I knew
very
he was.
common. You know, the first, of course, was Lone Wolf had a book about him, Gonzalez.
Oh.
And then, of course, Frank Hamer. I mean, you gotta have a book about the guy who hunted down Bonnie and Clyde, right? Yeah. Ever seen the movie The Highwayman? Yeah.
Probably.
It's a very good, Jody, my doctoral student, worked on that as one of their consultants. So, all the way back around to, all he wanted to do was earn his pay, to be worth his paycheck. I would argue he was that and more. And he's also a great poster child for putting up and saying, look, this is more the story of your average ranger, just doing the job he was hired to do, whether he agrees with the rules or not. You know, prohibition, you can tell that he's a little, you know, but it is the law, and it's what the people of Texas want, and he wasn't hired to pick his own rules, he was hired to enforce the ones they want. And so, I would argue that he's a great poster child for that, all of which goes around to Living Well is the Best Revenge. His book has already won 1 award, and so take that, Oklahoma, University of Oklahoma Press. Any questions about Mr. Wright, Captain Wright? A lot of information in it, and there's a lot more in the book. You want all kinds of details? We got details.
Have they raised the marker out of the ground?
No, they haven't.
It should be.
I know. You can still read it. I know. They're
You won't
working
read-
on the
You
jail.
won't read it in another 50 years.
Yeah, well, that's what I figure, is people will start coming to the jail and saying, hey, I was over at the cemetery. You can't, and that'll probably prompt them to pull it up, you know, drop a foot of concrete in there and chunk it back down. Oh, we got it. That's also not the best
Where did you say he
THC.
was buried?
Floresville,
Is,
it's the
okay.
county seat of Wilson, about 25 miles east-southeast of San Antonio.
Okay, I've heard of it.
It's the peanut capital of Texas. They have a giant peanut.
Okay.
Other questions? No?
Tell us about your other books that you've written.
Okay. Can I do this without sounding more arrogant than I already do? I have published 19 books so far. Book number 20 is coming out hopefully within the next year. And book number 21 should come out sometime next year. I've already got a publisher. One publisher says he'll get one out by this time next year. That's the book on, it's a book on Texas in the Civil War, the Texas cotton trade in the Civil War. And it's been overlooked and ignored by Civil War historians and Texas historians alike. The fact of the matter is, we made hundreds of millions of dollars shipping Texas cotton out, mostly through Matamoros, about 82%. We literally made $512 million, while at the same time Richmond was sending us $92 million to run the war on. So that money was very important to the Confederate armies on this side of the river. So that book's coming out. The other book is one on a guy who was a member of the Texas Cavalry USA during the Civil War and left a memorandum, a diary. And I've built up his story, which is rare. We don't have any other diaries. He goes on to be a very active Republican after the war. It's in the Convention of '69 and all that stuff. I have a book on Robert E. Lee. That goes way back. I came out in 2001, got nominated for a Pulitzer, but So did the book on John Adams by David McCulloch, so he was an HBO series and I wasn't, so it's all about timing. Maybe if that come out a year before, a year after, you never know. I have a biography of Rip Ford. I have 3 photograph histories of Tennessee, North Carolina, and South Carolina, the Civil War. Those projects were a lot of fun. Goodness, all kinds.
Did you research on Rodriguez?
I did quite a bit just so I could get the part that Wright played down pat. And the fact of the matter is, with Rodriguez, you mean Cortez, Gregorio Cortez? Which one?
Rodriguez, I thought that shut down top of the hill here in Tarrant County, Cena.
Oh, yes.
1947 after 5 raids.
Bizarrely enough, that's come back into my bailiwick, because I'm doing a book on an Italian artist named Papeo Capini, who did 234 pieces, 76 of them in Texas. He did the Frank, the guy who took over top of the hill and turned it into...
Fred Browning?
No.
Norris.
Norris, J. Frank Norris, thank you. He did the statue of J. Frank Norris, and I've been trying to place where in all that mess this thing appeared and got placed. Tangled it is top of the hill. But I've got a doctoral student again who teaches there, so he's been digging through the archives with me. But Hickman is the one that really got involved in that, Tom Hickman. And that's part of the thing that clouded his career and got him tossed out of the Rangers in the 30s. But living well is the best revenge. He comes back as commander of the Rangers in the 60s. He's also the guy that invented rodeo on the radio. Hickman's a good story. Somebody ought to do him.
What was Hickman's first name?
Tom Hickman, he's from Gainesville. Local boy.
I thought it was Dwayne.
Yeah. But he's got great Texas Ranger stories. Kind of like Wright. And that's why I want these guys to be remembered for what they did, what they accomplished. And there's a lot of really bad books out there right now. And I say bad not because of what they say, but because of what they say, and it's not based on research. They are not looking, the adjutant general record, I went through 40 or 50 boxes just to do this one book. It's a lot of work, but that's what you gotta do if you're gonna do it right, and be respectful of your subject. There's a book out on policing the border. George T. Diaz wrote it, called Border Contraband. The only thing he used for evidence is what people sang about in corridos or Mexican folk songs. It was as if I wrote a history of the Depression based on Woody Guthrie songs and Springsteen songs and Johnny Cash songs. We might have a different perspective on things. And especially when you get to the back of the way, you start saying, well, you know, right before I published the book, some local writers added 3 more stanzas to the song, so I've got it. It's like, dude, that's your evidence? 3 guys, 80 years after the fact, wrote 3 more. And these, you know, they talk about Gregorio Cortez being shot down and killed. Gregorio Cortez was arrested by Rangers, protected through 3 different trials, arrived safely at Huntsville, got a full free pardon less than 5 years later for killing 2 Texas lawmen, and died working in the Revolutionary Armies of Mexico in 1916. But that is not what you will hear from your Hispanic students. Oh no, the Rangers. Dude, read a book that's actually based on some research. Gregorio Cortez died south of the border, working in one of the small revolutionary forces down there. And that's what I was going to say about Wright. He and Rogers are the 2 guys that actually were there to arrest Cortez, Gregorio Cortez. And Wright actually served on 3 of the details that defended Cortez, because there were people who wanted to kill him. You know, he shot 2 lawmen, including a very popular sheriff. But that's why I think I did this book, and why I want to do more along the way, is I just have this compulsion to take stories that we've heard quite a bit and dig down and find that kernel of truth that's at the heart of it, and then do right. Or sometimes, you know, sometimes you do have to right, no? You're right, he was not a very nice person, but not in this case.
Well, your book is very interesting.
Well, thank you,
Very
ma'am, I appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Well, thank all of y'all for coming. Yes, sir. I do not have a website, but I'm on Amazon.com, so all the books are listed there, or most of them. I looked the other day, I guess they're out of inventory. You can always send me an email.
Okay.
I'd give you a card, but I ran out of them after the annual meeting.
No, I can
And the
relate to that.
little admin assistant is trying to buy me some more.
Your email on the,
Website of the TSHA,
okay.
Texas State Historical Association, Director of Publication. Or just Google me, I'm sure I'm all over the internet, good, bad, or indifferent. If there are no more questions, you're free to come up and ask me the ones you didn't want to ask in public or whatever.
Thank you.
If anybody else wants refreshments, please help yourself, okay? It was really Yeah, but you have, how did you remember that? Can you roll up?